Have you ever whispered Bloody Mary's name in the mirror? Have you ever heard the tale of the killer hiding in the back seat? What about Bigfoot, Mothman, or the Loch Ness Monster? Urban legends are everywhere, but where do these modern myths come from, and why do we believe them? Search urban legends in your chosen podcast provider and join me, Luke Mordew, as I retell the stories and uncover their history, their origins, and dark or curious truths that may lie within.
After a few seconds, we all decided it was time for bed. The next morning, we went for breakfast in the restaurant, which was on the floor above the bar and directly over it. I quickly established that the restaurant and the kitchen adjoining it were indeed sited directly above the bar, so the noises must have come from there. One of the waitresses saw me looking closely at doors and ceilings. She stopped what she was doing, smiled, and said, "You're looking for our poltergeist, aren't you?" This is episode 67 of the Haunted UK podcast, and in this episode, we'll hear about the many amazing and strange encounters that listener Jim Corbett has had over the years. Listener stories, a huge favourite of yours and ours. The tales of real experiences happening to real people in real everyday jobs and situations. It's been said many times by paranormal investigators and ghost hunters that the person walking past you on the street, for example, could be a ghost. Many are so realistic that they're often mistaken for real people, and witnesses only realise this after it's been pointed out. We've had a number of listeners who have sent in stories which have been so detailed and full of content that they have been developed into full, regular episodes. Those listeners, like all who send in their stories, are kind enough to work with the show and let us share their experiences and accounts. It's one such listener named Jim Corbett who was extremely kind enough to email in a series of incredible stories. It's these stories which you'll be hearing in this episode. Stories which span various chunks of Jim's life, but all with the mindset that Jim is always searching for the rational explanation behind it all. You'll soon see that Jim has had an amazing life so far, and even now at 70 years old, there's absolutely no stopping him. He hosts his own podcast with friend Kieran Casey, called The Artificial Hipsters Cross the Bridge. A mixture of discussions which include politics, modern life, and current affairs. I highly recommend you give it a listen. There are 30 episodes out there on all popular podcast platforms. Another amazing fact that Jim was kind enough to share with me is that he is a distant relative of a very famous sportsman, and is the reason for the Gentleman Jim reference in the title of this episode. James John Corbett became the world's first heavyweight boxing champion on the 7th of September 1892 under the new Queensberry rules. He took the title by knocking out opponent James L. Sullivan in the 21st round of their contest. The media dubbed him Gentleman Jim, and he became a sensation due to his more scientific approach and understanding of boxing. using quick movement and his jab to help him win fights. Jim obviously has many fascinating stories to tell, and a lot of those are related to possible paranormal phenomena. So, it's about time that we hand this episode over to Gentleman Jim. I don't think I'm a real believer in ghosts. Despite the numerous experiences reported in this account, I generally believe that there is a scientific explanation for most reported incidents, but I accept that we do not always know the causes, and that they can sometimes remain extremely mysterious. As a very young child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in 2 rooms in a condemned house in Camden Town, London, in the mid-50s, but we did move to a brand new council flat in 1959. We were a happy little family, and my dad worked very hard at night school. He was an electrician by day, but wanting to better himself, he studied hard, which indeed paid off when he became a chartered engineer. We shared a bedroom with our parents when we were very young, and one of my earliest memories was of a paranormal nature, in that it was a sort of out-of-body experience. About an hour after we went to bed, but before our parents also retired, I often experienced a strange sensation of leaving my body. I recall a familiar sensation to going over a humpback bridge and then floating about 2 feet above my sleeping body, before shortly drifting up to perch somehow on top of the large Victorian wardrobe. I could clearly see myself with my brother in bed, but nothing else. This would last, I would say, for about a minute or 2 before I slowly floated down and re-entered my body. I don't recall any other sensation nor any real ability to choose where I went or what I did, but it was the same experience on several occasions. I wasn't frightened, and I didn't think it was important or unusual, and I'd usually go off to sleep immediately afterwards. Eventually, the experience stopped, and I forgot about it. I must have been about 3 or 4 years old. I remembered it several years later when I heard a program about out-of-body experiences, although I preferred the explanation of a sort of waking dream just before sleeping properly, which I believe is called hypnagogia. Perhaps because of this experience, I've had a skeptical interest in ghosts and psychic phenomena since I was quite young. I remember being absolutely terrified at the age of about 8, when as an avid wolf cub in the Boy Scouts, our cub leader, Akela, would tell us a truly horrifying ghost story. Wolf Cubs was the name given to the younger section of the Boy Scouts back then, and as we were gathered around in the darkened school hall where we met for the cub leader, the story would begin. It started with the grisly finding at the bottom of an old well of the body of a young cub. This was not a huge success as an activity, for the leader was soon surrounded by about 20 boys, either singing quietly to themselves with their fingers in their ears or sobbing quietly in a blue funk, with the remainder crawling around looking for somewhere to hide. It took some time and the cessation of his tale to restore order. My dad, who was a no-nonsense engineer, had lived through the war as a child, and as someone who has also done his national service in the RAF, would have none of it when I asked him if there were such things as ghosts.
No, mate. People often make these stories up for a lark, but they're not true. There's a scientific explanation for everything, although we don't always know what the explanation is.
On other occasions, he would quote one of his favourite Shakespearean sayings, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy," which basically meant the same thing. One experience I had, which might pass as ghostly, happened when I was about 7, I suppose. My grandfather Bill was a school caretaker at a school in southeast London. Occasionally, from the age of about 6, my brother Dave and I would be packed off onto the train at Charing Cross for the shortest journey to Catford Bridge, where we would be collected by my grandmother. Sounds odd these days, doesn't it? But we never came to any harm. One day, Nan wanted some small errand from the local shop, and she gave me some money and told me where to go. I walked up the road to the shop, which was about 10 minutes away, and bought the few things Nan wanted. As I set out to return, I heard the sounds of lots of children happily playing and singing. It sounded like a school playground. I assumed there was another school nearby in the next street, but as I had no reason to look for it, I just went home to Nan's. Later in the evening, I just mentioned that I'd heard children from another school nearby at playtime. My Nan looked at me sharply. She told me it couldn't possibly be true. It was school holiday time and all the schools were closed. Of course they were. That's why we were staying with Nan and Grandad for a few days. So that was it. I must have been daydreaming. I forgot all about it until 20 years later, when I was researching the Blitz on London, which is still a hobby of mine 50 years later, and I came across an account of a German fighter bomber which had sneaked across the channel at around lunchtime and bombed and machine-gunned a school in Sandringham Road, Catford. 30 children were killed, and a further 12 adults, mostly teachers, also died. The dead were buried in a shared grave in Highgate Cemetery. You can look it up online, and the rebuilt Sandringham Road School still exists today. The shop I'd got Nan's messages from was in Sandringham Road, just a short way from the school. To this day, I wonder if I'd heard the sounds of the dead children singing and playing just before they were killed in 1943, about 20 years before my shopping trip. Until I was about 12, I was quite afraid of the dark. Every Monday evening for 5 years, I would walk down the length of Fortress Road in Kentish Town, North London, on my way to the Cubs and later the Scats, passing en route the unremarkable Roman Catholic Church. Unremarkable, except for the larger-than-life-size crucifix of Jesus on the cross, which was extremely lifelike, and a bit gothic in its very dark alcove between the church and the building next door. This didn't help my fear of the unknown very much, and I always walked on the opposite side of the road with my eyes averted from the grisly statuary. But I resolved as I got older to do something about it. I achieved this mainly by growing up, but also by forcing myself to go around in the dark and to deliberately face my fears. In this, I was aided by my best friend Charlie. One Christmas, my parents bought me an Ouija board, which was the board game of the year. My brother wouldn't try it with me, but of course Charlie did. Sitting in his bedroom at his nearby house one evening, we gave it a try. And guess what? It worked. At least the plastic planchette on which we were both resting a finger on as lightly as possible moved. It dutifully gave us some completely meaningless messages. We were both pretty surprised that the bloody thing moved at all. Sometime later, I worked out that the touch of the fingers had to be very light, so that tiny involuntary movements of one participant would cause the other to believe the planchette had moved, and from then on, it is almost an automatic but entirely natural process, known as the ideomotor effect. The answers to our questions were irrelevant, or maybe not. Charlie had a great interest in aviation. Indeed, he wanted to become a commercial pilot, and years later, he did. At that time, it was a few months before the first test flight of the English prototype of the Concorde supersonic airliner. Charlie was obsessed by this aircraft, so he asked the Ouija board if the first Concorde would crash. Okay, schoolboy obsession, but we were schoolboys after all. The planchette moved quickly to yes. At that time, my granddad was staying with us following the death of my grandmother, the same grandmother as just mentioned, and a few days later, I was talking to my dad and granddad about the Ouija experiment while we were doing the washing up. Granddad suddenly said, "Why don't you try to contact your grandmother?" His question pulled me up short, and I realized that maybe there was a wider context to consider, and one which was not very comfortable. Our brief time with the Ouija board soon came to a shuddering end. Charlie couldn't resist telling his dad about our little foray with the board, leaving his dad horrified. He said in no uncertain terms that the board was never, ever again to be brought into his house. He might also have phoned my dad to tip him off as well, because a little while later, Dad took me aside and said he didn't think any of us had realized how the Ouija board could influence people's feelings, and maybe not in a good way. Perhaps I should get rid of it, he suggested. Not long afterwards, Charlie and I quietly consigned it to the dustbin. I wasn't sorry to see it go. Shortly after this experience, the Soviet Union unveiled their latest masterpiece of industrial espionage, which was a Concorde clone that looked exactly like the real one, and which the press named Concordski. They began to hawk it around various Western air shows for a few months, until it crashed in Paris with the loss of the whole crew. Was that the first Concorde? Well, it certainly wasn't the genuine article, and no one knew if it was even capable of supersonic flight, but it was a direct copy of the real Concorde, and it did fly first, and it did crash. Does that mean the Ouija board worked and foretold the future? For me, the answer is an absolute no. I worked out for myself the mechanics of how it worked, and for every answer it got right, it got several wrong. I've made something of a study of Ouija boards and seances, and I have to say that I have come across no compelling evidence, but very many accounts of deliberate falsification of results and phenomena. Ghosts, however, are another matter altogether. Around this time, we started going to fundraising dances at my school. These were run by the Parents' Association, and they occurred about 3 times each term. They were fairly standard dances, a band and a bar, plus a certain amount of decoration and lighting of the school hall. I used to go because I used to help with the lighting, sound systems and decorations, and Charlie often came with me. Now, we didn't like dancing, and there were no girls our age involved anyway, and we were too young to drink, so we used to amuse ourselves by going on nighttime explorations of the school. We would disappear up corridors and staircases in the dark, and let me tell you this, schools can be very creepy places at night. I'm not sure why, but they are certainly atmospheric, especially those with a history, which mine had. I walked along one corridor which was where the first-year form rooms were. My first-year form master of a few years before had died recently just before my night adventure. The classrooms were all locked, of course, but each had a porthole window. One night, I looked through the porthole in the door of what had been my own form room. It looked a bit creepy in the dark, and then I thought I saw something move. At my school, teachers wore academic gowns, and I'm sure I saw something that looked darker than the background, possibly wearing some sort of cloak or maybe a gown. I was terrified, but rooted to the spot. Then the apparition, if that's what it was, disappeared. Now it could have been a shadow from the trees outside on a moonlit night, or much more likely, of course, just my imagination. I never saw it again, despite searching on more than one occasion, and in all honesty, I can't really put much credence on my own experience to classify it as being a ghost. Charlie and I took to going out for a few pints as our 18th birthdays got closer, if 16 is close, and we would walk up towards the pubs in Highgate Village via Swains Lane, which ran along one side of the famous Highgate Cemetery. I didn't see anything on any of the dozen or so times we had made this hike, except, well, on one dark winter's night. Charlie and I were about halfway up the hill to the cemetery chapel, which appears in at least one Hammer Horror Dracula film, and I heard a dog suddenly start barking, some way behind us. We both stopped and turned round. I couldn't see a dog, although I did see what looked to be a thinnish woman crossing the road to our side, about 100 meters behind us. I turned to look for the dog, but there was none to be seen. Then I looked at Charlie, and he was rooted to the spot. "Did you see that?" he said. "See what?" I replied. "That woman. She walked straight through the cemetery wall." Now, I hadn't seen that. I saw the woman crossing the road, but I had averted my eyes to the unsuccessful dog search before looking back down the road. But one thing we were agreed on, and that was that there had been a woman, and she had disappeared. Charlie said she'd walked straight through the wall, which I hadn't actually seen, but it was clear that she wasn't there anymore, and she can't have gone anywhere other than through the wall by one means or another, or back the way she came. We walked back down the hill to about the point where she'd been. The cemetery wall was a mixture of brick pillars and about 15 feet high cast iron railings. There were no holes nor gaps and no easy way to climb. I suppose a very accomplished gymnast or a parkour expert might have been able to contrive a leap over the wall, although it was very high. I don't believe that any such person could have done that without us seeing what they did. The gap between me glancing aside to look for a dog and returning my gaze to where the woman had been was only about 2 or 3 seconds, so I think I would have seen a climb or leap, which leaves a paranormal passing through the wall. Now, I cannot in all conscience say that I saw that, but even now 50 years later, Charlie asserts without doubt that that is exactly what happened. Charlie is a hard-headed, unflappable bloke. If he says he saw a woman pass through the wall, then I believed him, and I still do. How that could have happened, I have no idea. There followed a fairly fallow period of experiences whilst I was attending university, spending some time in the army, carving out a career, getting married, and having children. Life has a habit of getting in the way sometimes. In the military and hospital-based parts of my career, there were a number of instances which I will record in separate sections, but in my family life, there were a few things. Just after our 4th child was born in the late 1980s, I had a few promotions at work, so my wife and I were able to buy a large family home in North London. This house was unusual. It had obviously been in multiple occupation for some time, and indeed had been reclaimed by a bank for non-payment of the mortgage, which is why we got it cheap. In addition, the last proper owner had carried out some slightly odd improvements. The large attic space had the roof beams remodelled and a large single room created with a roof window. All the work looked a bit amateurish, but it was very robustly done. Access was via a sort of mini staircase which had been built up from one of the bedrooms in 2 reverse flights, each only 18 inches wide, so that when it was partitioned off, the bedroom was still a decent size. It came up into the attic in a sort of railed enclosure, presumably to stop people falling down the stairwell. On the ground floor, the large kitchen was foreshortened by about 5 feet, to enable a disabled bathroom to be installed to one side, and a sort of narrow dogleg corridor leading to the kitchen. Our next-door neighbour had lived on the road for years. She told us about a family with a couple of children who'd lived there with the wife's elderly father. He'd become increasingly disabled and the bathroom was for him. He lived and slept in the front room. I've provided these details because both the attic and the bathroom featured in some very odd events. Fairly shortly after we moved in, redecorated and cleaned up somewhat, things seemed fine. It was a very nice house and looked much better after we'd spent a little time and money on it. My wife used to retire early, and I usually locked up and made a cup of tea before switching off all the downstairs lights. I soon began to feel a little uneasy going up the stairs to bed, but I just shrugged it off. This uneasy feeling happened most nights and began to crystallize into an impression that someone was watching me go upstairs through the banister rails. Sometimes it seemed as if I was being watched by an old man. I didn't see anything, but the impression remained, getting stronger and clearer almost every night. I thought it was just my imagination, but I said nothing because I did not want to alarm my wife or young children, but this impression continued, and I became used to it that I gave it a name, Alf, and I said good night to him every night.
Good night, Alf.
I never had any unpleasant or frightening impression of Alf, and there was no other manifestations. Or so I thought. A year or so after we moved in, we decided to install a new shower upstairs and rip out the downstairs bathroom so as to reinstate the kitchen to its former size and replace the central door to the kitchen. As soon as this work was completed, I never experienced anything from Alf again. It was as if we had given him back his old access to the kitchen. and he was now content. A silly idea, I know, but that's how it felt. The attic room, however, was a different matter. One of my sons decided he wanted it as a bedroom, so we had a new staircase built properly as another flight on the existing main staircase, with an enclosed lobby at the top, so it complied with building regulations. The boys both used this room as a sort of playroom cum meeting room for them and their friends for as long as we lived in the house. While I was working on the electrics, my dad was an electrical engineer, don't forget, before it was used as a bedroom, I spent many hours up there after work labouring on its renovation. It certainly had its slightly odd atmosphere, but again, I just shrugged it off. After about 12 years, I obtained a new job in Ireland and moved there with my wife and 2 daughters. The boys by now were both over 21 and decided to stay in London where they'd both grown up and worked, and we agreed they should stay in their family house for a while until we all decided whether to sell up or to rent it out. They had several friends staying with them at different times. It was at this time a number of events started to occur. The most frequent was hearing voices in the attic room, but only from the stairs. As soon as the door was opened, the voices stopped immediately. There was nothing to be seen, and no way anyone could have hidden or got up there except via the main staircase. Both of my sons experienced this at different times, as did several of their friends. On one occasion, a friend and his fiancée stayed in the main bedroom and reported hearing footsteps walking across the room upstairs when no one was staying there. They also reported loud voices and even heard shouting from the room. The friend went upstairs to investigate, but of course, there was nothing up there at all. The man's fiancée vowed never to stay in the house again, and she didn't. My son also heard the noises of a party with music, and the noises of people laughing and singing. They were so realistic, they both assumed one of their friends was holding a party upstairs and went up to join the fun. Of course, the noises stopped as soon as they entered the room. Shortly afterwards, we decided to sell the house, but I had no knowledge of the apparent phenomenon that had been taking place. I don't count Alf as being part of these incidents. The boys told us afterwards about their experiences, and I told them about Alf. I don't know if these events were connected, but I was never able to find any reasonable explanation for any of them. The boys remained convinced the house was haunted, and we sold it fairly quickly afterwards. That was back in 2002. We sold it to a local businessman who was looking to use it for staff accommodation. The house has not been used as a family home from that day to this. Our house in Ireland is busy, bright, comfortable, and often filled with our grown-up children, grandchildren, friends and visitors. We have never experienced anything at all in all the years we've lived in it. But we did have one rather odd experience at a later date in Canterbury. We decided to pay a weekend visit there with my wife's cousin and husband. I've always loved Canterbury ever since I was a student at the university, and I have also always loved Canterbury Cathedral, which must be one of the most beautiful and historic places in the world. So I was delighted to find a small hotel right in the centre of the city. In fact, it was built into the walls of the cathedral precinct. As one might expect in a building which was nearly 1,000 years old, it was all a bit higgledy-piggledy, with rooms on several different levels and narrow corridors, reached by even more narrow stairs. In fact, when we were shown to our rooms, we went up onto the roof and across it into another door and another wing, but the rooms were comfortable, and we had one with a direct view across the cathedral, close to the main tower, and we were awoken by its bells in the morning, a truly idyllic setting. We only stayed for one night, and after a day's sightseeing and a very good restaurant for dinner, we returned to the hotel for a nightcap. We sat in the bar for about an hour chatting and joking until we were literally shocked into silence by a loud double tap, which came apparently from upstairs. When I say loud and tap, I greatly underestimated. It was a double bang. such as one might get from striking the floor above with a sledgehammer, although the bangs were close together and probably couldn't have been made by someone bearing such an implement so quickly. And it was as loud as a thunderclap going off, and that is very loud indeed. We were all instantly silenced and shocked. I assumed it was another resident encouraging us to make less noise. However, the young waitress serving at the bar didn't turn a hair. After a few seconds, we all decided it was time for bed. The next morning, we went for breakfast in the restaurant, which was on the floor above the bar and directly over it. I quickly established that the restaurant and the kitchen adjoining it were indeed sited directly above the bar, so the noises must have come from there. One of the waitresses saw me looking closely at doors and ceilings. She stopped what she was doing, smiled and said, "You're looking for our poltergeist, aren't you?" She smiled sweetly, entirely unconcerned. I just said that I'd heard something odd last night when in the bar. "A loud double knock?" she said. I nodded. "People often ask about it. We're all used to it, but we've never found a cause. I suppose buildings in occupation for 900 years are bound to pick up some spirits or such like." And that was the end of that. So, now that we've had a taster of some of the experiences which Jim, his family and friends have encountered, we'll now move on to a number of strange experiences from his military career. These stories contain many elements of the paranormal in many different environments, but what they all have in common is that they're all fascinating. In my very late teens and early 20s, I had a period with the military as an infantry officer. This was partly with a regular army regiment, but mostly with the Territorial Army. As part and parcel of this, I visited military bases and facilities all over the UK and Germany, and one or two other places. There are certainly ghost stories around many military locations, many of which have more than their fair share of military history and drama. I did have to visit the Tower of London a few times, and I've even had the opportunity to tour around at night. Of all the places in the world which have a ghostly tradition, the Tower deserves it best, but I'm sorry to say that I saw and heard nothing untoward, although I came across many people who had done so. It is the sort of place where it would be very easy to imagine headless ghosts and groaning noises. Another similar place which I'm familiar with is Hampton Court Palace, which again has many legends of ghosts, but I have never seen nor heard one there either. The Royal Air Force Museum at Colindale, located on the site of the former RAF Hendon, which was a fighter airfield during World War II, is supposed to have a few ghosts of airmen and the like. I was a member of the Friends of the RAFM some years ago, and I visited regularly. It used to have a whole classroom workshop from RAF Halton, which was the apprentice training centre for many years. When Halton closed, the classroom was taken to pieces and rebuilt in a first-floor gallery of the museum. Only museum freaks like me went to look at it. After all, it had no aircraft, which is what most people go to see, but it was alleged to have a ghost. There are different versions of how this ghost behaves. Some versions say it is a shadowy figure flitting between exhibits, whilst others say it produces low but indecipherable speech-type noises. Then there's the poltergeist activity, making things fall to the floor or fly across the room. I regret to say that I experienced none of these, although I must say I did feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes. On a few occasions, I had a feeling that someone was looking at me, and on another, that someone was following quite closely behind as I ambled through the exhibits, but I did not see nor hear anything. I believe there are more stories of ghosts relating to other parts of the building. I now turn slightly more to direct personal experiences. Early in my short military career, I received a request from my former school cadet force to attend their annual camp to assist with the training. I was delighted to help. Such camps were usually excuses for huge booze-ups in the mess after the cadets had been packed off to their billets. I obtained permission to attend from my battalion training major. The school cadet force was affiliated with the regiment anyway, and we liked to help out such requests as a PR exercise. So I turned up at the school on the appointed day for transport to the camp. No staff cars here. I was too junior to merit one anyway, so I was bounced from North London to Crowborough in Sussex in the back of a decrepit Land Rover. Crowborough camp is mainly a transit or training camp. It had no permanent regiments based there, just a sozzled old camp commandant who was a retired major, with a small civilian staff of groundsmen, storekeepers and handymen. There were only about 6 staff. Catering was either undertaken by regiments training there or mostly by catering contractors. The officers' mess was not very plush, although I did get a bedroom to myself. We operated a simple rotation for orderly officer, and as I had managed to wangle another place for one of my officer mates, we used to do it together most nights, rather than just getting sozzled in the mess every night with a bunch of old school teachers pretending to be officers, with the notable and noble exceptions of the colonel. He'd led a battalion ashore on Gold Beach on D-Day, and then there was the captain, who had won the Military Cross in Burma with the Shindits. So it was that Jack and I were asked, ordered, but we were proper officers, not school teachers in uniform after all, to drive over to the training area some 5 miles away in the battered unit Land Rover to check that all the cadets were okay camping out that night on a 36-hour exercise. The senior cadets were a capable bunch, most of them almost old enough for the regular army if they wished. Just as an aside, the senior cadet that night went on to be a brigadier, another was a colonel of artillery, a third was a group captain in the RAF, and a fourth was a captain of a Royal Naval destroyer. Quite a record for one relatively small volunteer contingent. Anyway, one of the objectives for going was to lock the gates on our way back to stop any undesirables getting in. Highly unlikely if you ask me, but rules are rules, and the gates were supposed to be locked at all times, as it was the Ministry of Defence land. When we got to the campsite, the cadets were all fine, but for some reason I had a complete brain crash and forgot to recover the gate keys from the senior cadet. To this day, nearly 50 years later, neither Jack nor I can work out why I did that. We wished them good night and drove back up to the gate, a distance of about half a mile. Of course, as soon as we got there, I realised my mistake. We couldn't get out because the gate was locked. Duh. And the road was extremely narrow, so we couldn't turn around either. It was my bad, so I set off to jog down the hill to the campsite to retrieve the said items. After doing so, I set out back to the Land Rover. It was uphill all the way, but I set out at a trot. It was no problem, as I was as fit as a flea back then. The road was now pitch black, and it was a moonless night with a number of large trees overshadowing it. The ground rose quite steeply to my right and dropped away very steeply on the left as a sort of bushy ravine. On the right for about 100 yards, a high wall had been built faced with concrete. On the left, there was a low curb, and if you went over it, you were in for a descent rather faster than was wise. I remember at the time thinking what a great location it would make for an ambush. Just as I came to the start of the cutting wall, I knew the road would swing right and left in a quite sharp dogleg. It was difficult to see anything, so I slowed a bit to a walk, as I didn't want to trip on the curb and begin an unsupported freefall. Then I stopped. I was literally frozen to the spot. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up, and I couldn't move a muscle, but worse than that was the feeling of absolute horror and a sensation of terrible mutilation. I also felt sure I could sense someone or something looking down at me from the top of the wall about 20 feet above me. I've written this exactly as I experienced it. I didn't hear nor see anything, but the mental sensations were as vivid and visceral as I had ever experienced in my life. Don't forget, I was a trained professional soldier. In tactical situations, I was as at home in the dark as I was in daylight. yet I couldn't shake the horrible sensations of mutilation and a terrible sadness. Oh God. Oh God. In fact, they were becoming stronger. I don't know how long I stood there. It seemed like an hour, but I guess it was a few seconds. Then I shook myself and set off again rather faster than before. As soon as I reached the Land Rover, the sensation stopped almost immediately. I wrenched open the door and leapt in. Jack flashed a torch in my face because he wasn't quite sure who had just got into the cab. "Fuck me," he said. "You're as white as a sheet." I threw the keys at him and he unlocked the gate, and we shot off into the night. On the way back, I told him what had happened, but we decided not to say anything for fear of becoming a laughingstock. The following day, I decided to tell the old colonel, but he quickly shut me up and said that I had probably realized it was a good position for an ambush, which I had, and another unit who were also on the training area might well have had a standing patrol watching from above the wall. He suggested I could have sensed them. Now, that was quite a good explanation, and certainly as a soldier, you can develop a sort of sixth sense when other people are around in tactical situations, so I accepted it, although I wasn't actually convinced. So that was that. Until a year later. I was able to attend the annual camp again, and this time the colonel and I were ambling down the same piece of road during the day, and he said, "Ah, this is the place where the ghost walks." I, of course, took him up on that statement. He remembered our previous conversation very well and said that he hadn't wanted to entertain any discussion in case any of the cadets overheard, but on this occasion, he and I were alone. He then told me that it was well known that the stretch of road was haunted by the ghost of a soldier who had been walking up the road as I had, when a large 3-ton lorry coming down too fast and too close to the wall had crushed him at the bend, and he was killed outright with the most awful injuries. That made more sense, but although I went to that training area many times, I never experienced anything again. But I suppose there could have been ghosts there. At one part of the area which few people went to, there was an area covered with small brick piles which had been used to transport wooden huts, although the huts had long gone. This area was called the Canadian Camp, where hundreds of Canadian soldiers had been stationed before they went off to the bloodbath at Dieppe in 1942. None of them came back. It was certainly an eerie place. On another occasion, I was at a large army camp in what was then Western Germany near Dortmund. It had been taken over by the army in 1945 and had previously been an SS barracks. One evening, the medical officer came into the mess and downed a large scotch before saying anything. I was quite friendly with him, and he looked a bit shocked. Assuming he'd had some bad news or something, he said, "I've just seen a ghost. Or rather, ghosts." We went over and sat down in a corner of the mess, and he told me he'd been in the medical centre of the camp, which was in part of a converted barrack block on 3 floors. The building was made of concrete, and he said he'd seen several shadowy figures descending the stairs, accompanied by the noise of several steel-tipped jackboots marching down. He'd been fixed to the spot, and the figures which he described as being quite dark were SS and wore black uniforms, so this was plausible, I suppose. After a few seconds, the figures and the footsteps had faded away. He was a hard-headed doctor, and he didn't strike me as being particularly imaginative, so I believed he thought he'd seen and heard something. There were a few stories about dark phantoms wearing German helmets around the camp, mostly, I suspect, put about by fed-up squaddies on sentry duty or after a few too many in the NAFI, as the other ranks bar was known. I suggested we should both go over there straight away and check the area for anything unusual, and that's what we did. We went to the foot of the concrete stairs. It was very basic, as were a lot of wartime buildings in Germany and Britain, and apart from the usual army white walls, the stairs were bare concrete. It had a pronounced echo, but was well lit. He pointed out to where he'd been standing when he'd first seen the phantoms at the top of the flight, and the point where they disappeared about 2/3 of the way down. The stairs went up 3 flights to the second floor. There were offices on the first floor and residential rooms on the third floor, which were mostly unoccupied. We started to walk up the stairs when my colleague stopped dead. "Can you hear them?" he said. I listened hard, and I have to say, I could hear something, possibly a few footsteps from well above us, but not the trampling of jackboots. It could have been anything, and there may well have been some people in the building legitimately. The MO agreed that it was nothing like as dramatic as the earlier occasion, and we saw nothing. Anyway, we returned to the mess. A few days later, I asked the battalion adjutant, an aging major, if he'd heard any such stories. He had, but he said he had never experienced anything himself, but he knew others who had claimed to have witnessed various phenomena. So I left it there, until about 20 years later, when I was dining with a very eminent professor of medicine. I asked him where he'd trained, a usual question to doctors. He said London University and the Army. He had done 4 years in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Of course, when I asked, he told me where he had been based, and yes, it was the barracks in Wörl, where I had been. He also, quite unbidden, told me an almost identical story to my old MO friend, of hearing the jackboots marching down the stairs of that same building. When I told him my story, he looked enormously relieved and said that I was the first person who had believed the story. Well, up to a point, but I didn't say that. I come now to one of my strangest experiences, which took place a year or so later. By this time, I'd returned to my Territorial Army battalion based in London, and we were undertaking a 2-week camp on Dartmoor, based at the training camp at Oakhampton. As a training centre, it was built and equipped to accommodate a whole battalion, which would have been about 1,000 men, when it was built halfway through World War I. Oakhampton Camp had a well-equipped single-storey medical centre with 2 smallish wards of about 10 beds each, and an operating theatre which was almost never used. It also had a resident matron who was on the camp staff, a retired army nursing sister. She took no nonsense from anyone, but was a jolly and extremely efficient nurse. She had her own office, which was an alcove with a standard army single bed, where she slept when she was on call, which was whenever there were patients in residence. We had a different MO, Tony, who was a newly qualified doc, awaiting a posting to a regular army establishment somewhere or other. He'd become a bit of a mate, and he sidled up to me in the mess bar. It's amazing how much work gets done in regimental officers' messes. "Hi, Lofty," he said. That being my nickname because I was quite tall. "I'm covering for the old dear tonight, and I've got to go over now to relieve her for the night. She's been on duty 3 nights running now with the measles outbreak. Fancy a snifter over there?" I readily agreed, and we strolled over and entered the sickbay. It was basically an L-shaped building with a long corridor, with the matron's office about 2/3 of the way down. 2 sets of double doors gave onto the 2 wards, and the corridor turned smartly to the left, and carried on for a shorter distance where a sluice room, a toilet and washroom, a kitchen, a dressings room and a consultation room were on one side, and a collection of linen, dressings and assorted other stores were on the other. Matron popped her head out of the office. She already had her hat on, so we were expected. "Ah, there you are, Captain Jones. And a friend as well." Tony introduced me, and after the usual niceties she said,
"Yes, well, we only have 2 soldiers in residence, and at present they're sleeping. The outbreak seems to be waning, at least. They shouldn't cause you any trouble. I must be off. My husband wonder where I am. Don't drink too much."
And with a twinkle in her eye, off she went. Our reputations must have preceded us. We entered her office, which had 2 chairs, and sat down. Tony produced a bottle of scotch. I moved to close the door, but he said, "No, don't do that. We have to keep an ear out for the patients." That seemed reasonable enough. Then he suggested we'd better just do a check, just to make sure the lads were okay and everything was locked, except for the front door, of course. casualties have to be able to get in. So we solemnly and quietly inspected the 2 patients, one in each ward, presumably because they both snored very loudly. We checked all windows were locked and all the facilities and stores as well. Then settled down for a chat and a drink. We were warm and comfortable and chatting freely, but nothing near to being in any way inebriated. Then we heard a door close in the short corridor. We both started and looked at each other. In the few seconds while we tried to identify the noise, we heard another door close. This one sounded like one of the ward doors. Neither noise was very loud. There was no crashing and banging, just a careful closing of doors, such as someone returning from the toilet might make who didn't wish to disturb anyone. Of course, we both jumped up and shot out into the corridor. Tony checked the toilet, which was empty, while I went to check that no one had gone outside via the main door. Tony checked all the locked stores and other rooms, and of course, all was still locked. Then we crept into the 2 wards and found the patients who were still sleeping soundly. Having checked all the windows, we returned to the office. One of the patients must have got up for a wee and we didn't hear him go out just when he came back. He must have gone straight back to sleep when he got into bed again, I said. Tony looked unconvinced. That's why I asked you to come over, he said. It happens every night, multiple times. We went back into the office, now primed for something else. We didn't have long to wait when we heard exactly the same noises as before, and we both dived into the corridor, just as we heard the second door close. I was actually looking at it, but there was no movement whatsoever, just the noise of the door closing. Of course, we bundled into the ward, but there was no one there except a snoring soldier. He couldn't possibly have got back into bed without us seeing him, so back to the office we went. I must say, I took a fairly deep draught of the scotch. We discussed what on earth could have made the noises. Then we heard something different. It was the front door slamming closed. Of course, we piled out into the corridor again. I definitely heard a few steps approaching from the door, but they stopped about halfway. Tony insisted he heard them walk past us. I certainly heard them from around the corner though, and then what sounded like the door to the linen store closed. We checked all those doors, and apart from the toilet, they were all locked, including the linen store. We opened that door, not sure what to expect. Inside, there was nothing. Just loads of pressed sheets and pillowcases, piled tidily on the shelves. Back in the office, we discussed what to do. Tony didn't want to say anything to Matron, because she had to spend several nights every month on night duty there on her own. Tony said he'd been there on 2 separate nights before this and had heard similar things each time. I thought he should ask her if she'd experienced anything. If she said no, then it was likely there was some sensible cause. If she said yes, then she must have got used to it. Tony decided to go to bed, and I went back to my room in the mess, but I agreed to go back at 7 a.m. when Matron came back on duty to give Tony some moral support before breakfast and the day's training began. Matron was her usual jolly self and had just arrived before me. Tony started to tell her what had happened when she cut across him.
Doors closing, footsteps, that sort of thing.
We nodded.
Well, that's just Jack doing his rounds.
Jack, it turned out, was a medical orderly who had assisted Matron a few years before and who normally did the night shifts. He used to check on the patients and make sure there were enough sheets for the next morning's bed changing. Then he would leave with a happy, "Goodbye, Matron," before he left. She said sometimes she still heard him say goodbye. He was also a depressive, which is why the army had given him this very light-duty job. Unfortunately, about 2 years before we heard him on his rounds, he'd committed suicide.
About 10 o'clock at night, he hung himself in that linen cupboard.
How do you know? I asked. She looked up at me sharply.
I found him, of course.
So that was that. A few days later, we returned to our base in London, and although I remained with the military for a few more years, I had no further experiences. As you've now already come to realise, Jim has had a colourful and varied career, which has taken him down many paths. This next and last collection of stories revolve around him working in a profession which not only puts a person in an environment where illness, tragedy and death are a daily part of the job, but also the buildings where these frailties of human life take place can, and very often do, play their parts in telling their stories. We're of course talking about the NHS and hospitals. I suppose both of my last two accounts could also be included in this section. I started work in the NHS in 1978 and in 1980 in a very boring administrative job as office manager at the area headquarters of a North London health authority. In 1983, following a major reorganisation of the NHS, which they have every 5 years or so, and my achieving a postgraduate professional qualification, I was promoted as Deputy Manager at Barnet General Hospital on the border between London and Hertfordshire. There is still a Barnet Hospital on the same site, but virtually all traces of the old hospital where I worked, apart from the nurses' home, which is now a management centre, have been eradicated completely, and a new, larger hospital was built about 20 years ago. But that old hospital had a history. The first block was built as a workhouse hospital in the 1830s, complete with a workhouse master's very imposing residence and a large apartment for the matron. During the 19th century, the hospital acquired a small farm, a large nurses' home, and towards the end of the century, a large 6-ward block, plus kitchens and an operating theatre. Various other facilities like offices, laundry and a mortuary were dotted about this large and very pleasant site, with views from the heights of High Barnet across North London. In 1939, 7 24-bedded wards were built in single-storey short-term prefab huts as part of the Emergency War Hospital Service, with another 3 huts added, the laboratories and the X-ray department. Some of these temporary huts were still in use well into the 21st century after the new hospital was built, long after I'd left. None of them remain today. Soon after I arrived at Barnet, I became close friends with the District Fire Prevention Officer Joe. That was his real name, although he's been dead for over 30 years now. Joe's office was at the very top of one of the oldest blocks of the hospital, which housed our large department for care of the elderly. I often used to pop to see him. He did a good line in lunch invitations and meetings in the pub. I should add that there was a ferocious drinking culture at Barnet General, and indeed in most of the health service. Many had purpose-built staff social clubs, as we did, which used to offer lunches, a bar and a snooker table at lunchtime and in the evening. Liquid lunches were therefore quite common, and in the nearby district offices little work got done in the afternoon. The hospital itself wasn't quite as bad as that, but that was before the NHS was modernised. Anyway, that's how I got to know Joe, who was much older than me, but my wife and I would socialise with him and his wife Mona quite often. One day, I was on my way up the stairs to his office when a young girl in a blue dress ran down past me quite quickly. I guess she was about 12, and I had to step aside to avoid her. I was a bit surprised by her appearance, not just because she was running, but also because children were a very rare sight in the geriatric block. Anyway, I pressed on up the stairs, soon arriving at his 3rd floor eyrie. As we were chatting, I mentioned the girl. Joe sat up and looked at me straight. "So you've seen her? You're lucky. You usually have to be here at night on one of the wards." I was a bit taken aback, but he continued. "Young lady of about 12, blue dress?" I nodded and asked who she was. "Lord bless you, sir." He always called me sir and favoured the almost Victorian style of speech of my grandparents. "Why, that's our little ghost." He said he'd seen her many times, and nearly all of the nurses and senior nurses had seen her too. Over the coming years, I asked many of them if it was true, and most of them confirmed that it was. It seems she took the form of a workhouse child. Girls in workhouses were made to wear blue dresses, and it is a common feature of old hospital ghost stories because many of them started out as workhouse hospitals. We could never establish any name or story behind the girl's appearance, except that she was said to appear shortly before a patient died. Frankly, this was a self-fulfilling prophecy because sadly, there are few sizable geriatric units where patients don't die of natural causes on a weekly or even daily basis anyway. Some years later, we were engaged in a major refurbishment of that block, and in the basement, workmen found a false wall. When it was demolished, it was found to house 3 pauper cells, complete with manacles, where the poor unfortunates were presumably incarcerated at times for bad behaviour. There were no skeletons in the manacles, I'm pleased to say, but we did remove them and donated them to the Barnet Museum, where I presume they can still be seen today. One of the most surprising events happened just before I moved to another hospital. It is a feature of most modern hospitals with paediatric units that fewer children die in hospital today compared to previous times. This is mainly because the major killers, smallpox, diphtheria, polio, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough and tuberculosis, have been mostly eradicated, or at least dramatically reduced by vaccination. Leukemia, another horrible child killer, now has many possible treatments, and although not vanquished, it is still uncommon for children to die of it. So when it is known that there is a child in the paediatric ward who is in extremis, a pall of sadness falls over the whole staff. It was in just one circumstance that a child did die in our children's ward. As one may imagine, the child's parents were distraught with grief, having sat day and night with the poor little one. They asked if they could see the Roman Catholic chaplain, which is not an infrequent request. Our chaplains were priests of the nearest churches to us, and the Roman Catholic priest was on another call, but we were promised he would get to the ward as soon as possible. The parents decided to wait, so they were put into a private room to await his arrival. Shortly, the priest did appear on the ward and went in to console the parents for about an hour. When he left, the parents were surprised to see another priest come in almost straight away to offer them spiritual support. They thanked him, but said it was okay as they had been seen by the other priest, and his wonderful words had given them such comfort that they were now happy that their child was in a better place. The second priest was shocked. He told the parents there was no other priest in the parish on that day, and that his housekeeper had given him the message as soon as he arrived back from his first call. This was just before the advent of mobile telephones. "Oh well, you can catch him up and talk to him," the parents said. "He left just before you came in. You must have passed him in the corridor." The second priest immediately notified the ward sister that he had not seen any other priest and the hospital had not called in any other priest. This was relayed to my office very quickly, and within a few seconds the whole hospital was alerted to the possible existence of someone impersonating a priest. The porters searched the whole site and local roads. We had a special procedure for this because we had been caught out by someone impersonating a doctor a few years earlier, but luckily no patients were affected. No one was found. The parents were adamant that whoever this person was, they would be eternally grateful for the comfort he provided. Before I wrote this story, I checked with a former colleague from that time with whom I'm still in touch with. Our recollections are virtually identical. I was at Barnet Hospital until 1988, and one last event happened shortly before I left. I sometimes had to work late or was called in to assist with some problem. My office was on the first floor of a smallish annex, which had once been the ophthalmic ward, and was at the end of a corridor about 20 yards long, I suppose from the head of the stairs. Also, at the head of the stairs was a double toilet. The corridor led into the main hospital admin office, and mine was off that. When working late, I often used to sit in the main office, so it was one night at about 1 a.m, and I was just preparing to go home after having been called in a few hours before. I heard footsteps on the stairs, so I assumed that either someone was using the toilet or was coming to see me. So I went out into the corridor, but there was no one out there, and the toilet door was locked as was usual, since we had found a psychiatric patient sleeping in there the previous month. There was nowhere else to go. I went back into the office and sat with the door open so I could see along the corridor. Before long, I heard the steps on the stairs just as before, then a few more, then the sound of the toilet door closing. I saw nothing, no person nor any ghostly presence, but when I checked the door, it was still locked. I decided I'd better go home at once. I have no explanation for this story, nor the priest one. The blue girl, I suppose, could have been a hallucination or possibly some sort of group suggestibility, but if so, a lot of people saw it at different times. A few years later, I was working in another hospital just outside London. It was the smallest of the hospitals I had worked in, being a specialist orthopedic unit. It had been owned and run by an order of nuns for many years as a child's TB sanitarium because it was high on a hill in open fields, far away from the London smog. Just after World War I, it had dealt with many children who were treated for TB, who often had orthopedic complications, which was why when TB declined, the orthopedic side expanded. Many of these children came from very poor backgrounds and would be in residence for long periods of time. Their care was partly funded by the sisters' fundraising and partly by the local councils from where the patients lived. Hence, the children had to be clothed, and almost needless to say, the ubiquitous blue dresses and blue suits for the boys were much in evidence. As was normal right up until the 1980s, unmarried nurses and especially student nurses were often residential at the hospital. More than one nurse, including two of my acquaintances who still worked in the hospital, claimed to have woken at night to find a small girl dressed in blue sitting quietly, weeping at the end of their beds in the nurse's residence. When they sat up or said anything, the ghost disappeared. Whilst I was there, the night security officer claimed that he'd often heard a child crying in the admin block of the hospital and had briefly glimpsed a figure in blue coming down the stairs. He also heard scurrying footsteps from the floor above, in what was a deserted building at night. One night, while working late, I heard doors in my corridor opening and shutting quite frequently. I got used to them, but never saw anything. Shortly before I left to come to Ireland, one of the nurses who had seen the girl said to me over lunch in the canteen, "Of course you know that the nurses' residence used to be a children's ward, don't you? Not the big nurses' home, but the small group of rooms above your office." Now, I thought there was only an attic or roof void above my office. When we'd finished lunch, she took me outside and we looked up at the roof of the two-story building. There were a series of skylights let into the roof, including several above my office. "Shall we investigate?" she said. And investigate we did. She found a key to a narrow door in the first-floor corridor, which I thought was a store cupboard. Behind it, there was a very narrow but surprisingly bright flight of stairs which led up to a small collection of rooms coming off either side of a narrow central lobby. Each room was almost as it had been left. Even the very dusty and moth-eaten beds were still made up, and the carpets had nearly rotted into the floorboards. It was a bit like the Mary Celeste. I asked why the rooms had not been cleared. She looked at me for a while and said, "Well, it doesn't matter now, it was years ago. We were all sworn to secrecy, but so many nurses complained about it that eventually the management decided to empty it out and lock it up for good. It's never been reopened since. I've always wondered why." We're nearly at the end of this marathon. My last hospital where I was chief officer was in County Cork. Most of the city's hospitals were run by orders of nuns, but from the 1960s onwards, it became more and more difficult for the orders to find the money to pay for high standards of healthcare. The health was run on a very hand-to-mouth basis, so very gradually the Irish government started to take over the funding from the sisters, who continued to provide much of the nursing care and whom now drew a salary, whose money, I might add, was ploughed straight back into the development fund. When I got there in the early noughties, the matron was still a sister of the order, and there were about 12 sisters in residence, most of whom performed some sort of function for the patients. The part of the building in which I worked was on the 3rd floor of an early 19th century building, although a large part of it went back to the 18th century. However, there were much later additions, including a 200-bed block with path labs and a major emergency department. The whole place became a teaching hospital with over 1,500 staff. Great oaks from little acorns grow indeed. The sisters did not encourage people to talk of the supernatural, so I didn't hear of any stories until I'd been there for some time. I had an office with my PA next door. There were also another 3 or 4 offices which housed the hospital personnel department. I used to work late there, and I was on call much more than I had been before, partly because I was the only one who would take it on. The Irish system had a very different idea of hospital management to the way I'd been trained in. I was in my office one night at about 8 o'clock after a meeting, just getting a few things sorted out for the next day. The personnel manager poked his head around the door to tell me he was going. He'd been to the same meeting, and I just said that I'd be staying over for a few minutes longer. "You're a better man than me. You wouldn't catch me staying here on my own after dark." Obviously, I asked him why, and he told me he'd seen the hooded figure of a nun in the corridor on more than one occasion. Now, one of the routes to my office was a shortcut from the 2nd floor of the main hospital, through the day surgery unit and down the back stairs to the next floor down. After about 8 p.m, the lights were always off in the day unit, so it was pitch black. As I have said before, I'm not in the slightest bit fazed by being in the dark. In fact, I used to practice walking through the dark parts of the hospital, so I knew where to go without the lights, in case of some disaster or failure, which happens surprisingly often in hospitals. One evening, I was in my office when I heard footsteps along the corridor in the day unit on the floor above. I thought it odd because with everything closed there was no reason for anyone to come that way, unless they were coming down to see me via the shortcut, which the senior night nurses often did. So, I waited for someone to come to see me, but no one turned up. I waited for a while, and then it happened again, so I jumped up to go to the back stairs to see if anyone had come down, but no one did. This time, I went up and walked all the way through the day unit to the main hospital and saw absolutely no one. I also checked the 4 small bedrooms on the way, and each one was locked, as I would have expected. I just shrugged it off and I started back through the unit in the dark. When I was level with the last bedroom, its patient alarm went off. This can only happen if a bell pull inside each bed was pulled inside the locked room. A loud buzzer also started to sound, and a red light outside the room began to flash. Now, all this was quite unsettling, but I had a master key, so I let myself into the wardroom and switched the light on. There was no one there. The 4 beds were pristine, awaiting the next day's patients, but above one bed, the nurse call light button was flashing. So I just switched it off and the buzzer stopped, and the red light went out. Now the question was, who had switched it on? I went back down to my office and had just sat down when I heard it go off again. I went up again, and the alarm was operating just as before. I switched it off, locked up, and came back downstairs. This time, I called the duty electrician because we couldn't have that thing going off all night. He lived close to the hospital and appeared in my office about 10 minutes later. As we arrived, the alarm went off again. He looked knowingly at me and said he'd been called out for this before. We went back up and switched it off, as I had already done twice before. He said he thought the best thing to do was to switch off the alarm system for the ward altogether, and he'd switch it back on in the morning when the patients turned up. We also called in the alarm specialists to check the system the following day. They gave it a clean bill of health and told me that there was no way the alarm could be activated other than someone pulling the cord beside the bed. but we know better. Overall, we never found a reason to explain the alarm operating on its own at night. We took to turning it off as soon as the last patient was discharged when the nurses went home. Now, although this is my last account, I have one final postscript. Just before I retired, I decided to make a film about the hospital and its history. As part of this project, I interviewed one of the old hospital managers who I had succeeded about 15 years before, and also a very aged sister who had worked in the hospital for over 50 years, including a spell as a matron. When we'd finished the final interview, I kept the camera running and asked her if she could recall any incidents of a supernatural interest. If I had asked her that 10 years before, I would have been eviscerated on the spot, but now approaching her 80s, she was more mellow. She thought for a moment and said, "Well, just one thing. I heard a banshee." Now, banshees are Irish ghosts or spirits which haunt a place when people of certain Irish clans were dying. They were famous for their terrifying high-pitched screams or moans which cease when the patient dies. I had enormous regard for this sister, as she was a woman of enormous integrity and renowned for her charity and care across the 5 decades she had served the people of County Cork. Had anyone else told me this story, I would not have believed it. But from her, I did, although I can't explain it. She said she had retired to bed in one of the old attic rooms in the hospital in the late 60s. A patient of one of the clans, I think it was the McCarthy clan, was slowly dying in the hospital, and the sister said she was awakened about midnight by the unearthly screams of the banshee. She pulled the bedclothes over her head and recited the rosary until 4 a.m. when the screams thankfully stopped. It turned out that the patient had died at the same time. The matron of the day called all the sisters together and told them that they were never to say anything about the night's events at all. They'd all heard it, of course, but she said she didn't think it mattered if she told the story now. I asked her what it sounded like, and she thought for a moment and just said, "Absolutely awful and inhuman." I can't beat that. It goes without saying that the team at the Haunted UK podcast are hugely grateful to Jim for being incredibly kind enough to share these fascinating experiences with us. But I think you'll all agree that even when Jim was trying to find those threads that could possibly be pulled and tied together to form some sort of explanation, the incidents were just too compelling to explain away, mainly because most of them had multiple witnesses. Credible witnesses, and surely they're not all lying. Whether you've served in the armed forces, the emergency services, or worked in an office or factory, maybe a warehouse, maybe you've lived in a city like London for a lot of your life, like Jim, a city rich and steeped in history, grisly tales, and graveyards like Highgate, with vampires and women dissolving through walls. Or perhaps you've lived in a small place with big stories, a town stacked with strange tales, a village rampant with legends. No matter where you are, no matter who you are, or what you do for a living, the next person to have an entire episode dedicated to their paranormal experiences could be you.